Hello, everybody. Welcome to the podcast. My name is Tad Hinze, and I'm actually the brother of Laura Lofgreen. She's the author of Starving Girl, a memoir, my 30-day experience with the miracle of intermittent fasting and prayer. I think it's fair to say that we were raised by authors and avid readers. Our parents have a room in their house where literally the entire walls in the room are covered with books from floor to ceiling. The bookshelves were not enough, so Dad built an extra shelf on top of the bookshelves so we could add more books. And so we grew up surrounded by books. So with that background, we come to the table. My sister Laura and I, we have a lot of love and respect for each other, a lot of openness in our relationship where we can share, and it's a safe space to share ideas with no judgment, and we just kind of like to create together. So we wanted to invite you, the listener, to participate in that today, and hopefully you enjoy it. A lot of people aren't familiar with the term intermittent fasting. How did you learn about this? What does it mean? How did you apply it?
Well, I had just had my sixth baby. I was 43 years old. And honestly, I was in a really rough place. I was about 75 pounds overweight. I was just overwhelmed. That was my word of the year, overwhelmed. I was always rushed. My personal goals, I was always procrastinating. I was short-tempered, sleep deprived, and I was struggling with belly fat. I couldn't even reach my feet because I had so much weight in my belly. So I don't really know how it started, except for to say it was God. I have a deep faith, and I've grown up fasting. In my faith, we fast the first Sunday of every month, and we skip 2 meals. So we would skip breakfast and lunch and then eat dinner. And fasting starts with a purpose and intention. So as a child, when I would fast, and I never enjoyed it, I would try to get out of it any chance I could, but I would fast for someone in my family who was sick, or maybe even something going on in the world I would fast for. So since becoming a mother, my oldest son at the time was 16, I hadn't fasted for almost 20 years. And I was happy to not participate in a monthly fast. I'll tell you that right now. I loved food, and I couldn't go for more than 2 or 3 hours without eating. So I felt impressed on January 3rd of 2016 to fast. It just shows how strong the impression was that I actually followed through with it. I fasted that day. At one point I forgot and ate something. At another point I was so hungry I went out and juiced a grapefruit that I picked off my tree, but I got through the fast, and it was so incredible. It was just moving on so many levels. I just felt like the voice of God was speaking to me this entire day about my own personal goals and things that I needed to overcome. So at the end of that day, when I ate my dinner, I felt like I wanted to fast the next day. And I actually felt like I should fast for 30 days. So the first 14 days of my fast, I continued that pattern. I skipped breakfast and lunch and ate dinner. And it wasn't until the 14th day that I was reading a People magazine, the issue that shows people who've lost half their body weight, that I read about a girl who had done intermittent fasting to lose weight. I've never heard of fasting in any other context but religion. So I got online and discovered that intermittent fasting is a daily 16-hour fast. And I was able to read about all the health benefits and that it was a tool for weight loss. So although I call it fasting when I started, what I realize now is that I was doing a daily intermittent fast. I was fasting anywhere from 16 to 18 hours a day. And I was losing weight. By the time I realized what I was doing was actually a weight loss tool, I'd already dropped enough weight to be able to put on clothes in my closet that I thought I would never wear again. So that's how I discovered intermittent fasting. And I felt impressed the first day I started my fast to write about it. So every day of my 30-day fast, I wrote about it and eventually published it in a book.
You mentioned that you have been overweight and that you had belly fat. People who know you would describe you as very happy, cheerful, bubbly person, never in a bad mood. So these, as you explain in your answer, like, you were short-tempered and irritable and stuff. Very few people, maybe other than the people living inside your home, your husband and kids, see that side of you very often. So with the intermittent fasting, since you've been a lifelong dieter, why did traditional dieting fail? And why did intermittent fasting succeed for you?
Well, I've been dieting since I remember, even as an 8-year-old. I'm trying to control what I ate and being uncomfortable in my body. I don't remember a time, even in my earliest memory, feeling comfortable in my body. And so my whole life has been a diet. And I actually was a very athletic teenager and young adult. I did high school tennis and diving. I was a runner up until I had my first child. I did 10Ks and half marathons, and I always felt fat. I never felt like I fit in with other women that I saw in society. And so dieting had been a horrible experience. Looking back now that I've been intermittent fasting for over a year, dieting really created a victim out of me. It was a constant world of doing without, having to go without. And so I saw myself as a very unfortunate experience. I never succeeded on diets, and I would try and try, become obsessed with food. I remember at one point as a teenager, dreaming about pizza because I wouldn't allow myself to eat it. And so I was either going to give up dieting on that day, January 3rd, and just accept myself overweight. I was ready to just say, accept yourself, stop being a failure in dieting, and just be happy. Or lose it for good and just get over this. So when I started fasting, the biggest difference is intermittent fasting is not about food. It's about a set amount of time that you don't eat. It's, for somebody like me who's really struggled with instructions, and I could never follow a diet that was like, eat a third cup of hummus with 3 celery sticks at 11 o'clock. And then at 2 o'clock, eat rice cakes with a piece of salmon. I could never stick with something like that. But intermittent fasting is eat, don't eat. It's literally a 3-word instruction on how to live. But what really made the difference for me is that I included intermittent fasting with prayer. If I would not have intentionally set aside that fast for somebody I loved, and know that God is taking my fast, my sacrifice, and then in turn using it to bless somebody else, I don't think I ever could have committed to it. Dieting had always been about me. Intermittent fasting with prayer was about somebody else. So when I felt hunger, there was that reminder that my sacrifice of going without food would bless somebody else. That's why I could stick with it, because it wasn't about me. It was about the people I loved.
There's a quote in your book on page 85 that kind of articulates what you were just describing. It says, "While fasting, I wasn't trying to fix my problems, but praying God would fix somebody else's problems. It allowed me to make sacrifices for other people I wasn't willing to make for myself. I'd always been a giver, and I'd always been willing to put myself on the back burner. So fasting was a very comfortable place for me to have other people's interests at heart. In other words, it took my mind off my own self-doubts and insecurities. The fast was like so many of God's gifts, where he had asked a sacrifice of us first, and what he was actually doing was giving us back the blessings 100 times over. Now, based on what I know about you, since I've known you since birth, as you mentioned, 40 years, this week, I just turned 40, so 40 years. What I know about you is that you're very service oriented. You served a 18-month mission for your church. You've given your time to various, organizations to provide service. You serve your family. You're comfortable in that role of serving, and partly because you have a lot of love for other people. It almost sounds like you love other people more than you love yourself. How has that changed through intermittent fasting?
Well, it's always been easy for me to see the good in others. And that's true. I don't know if you'd call it a gift or a curse, depending on, what stage of life I've been in, but I do tend to care very deeply about other people. And that's where this discussion of, feeling like trash comes back. And perhaps the love I feel for other people has helped me learn to love myself, because it does bring me so much joy. I would much rather be looking outward than looking inward. And so intermittent fasting, it's almost like you take this term, this medical term, intermittent fasting, this great tool for weight loss, this great tool for mental clarity, for improved blood sugars and blood pressure, for improved sleep, all these things that the medical profession has learned about intermittent fasting. And then you look at the scripture, the religious reference of fasting. Fasting is in so many different religions. It's Hindu, Muslim, Buddhist, Jews, Christians, Catholics. Fasting can be found in all these different religions. So it's a very universal concept that crosses cultural and religion. So it's something that God has created. And I certainly would not imply that you need to do a daily fast to worship God or to feel love for others. But I would say that fasting has more power than I ever realized. It's kind of an untapped power. I think the power is opened up when, for me anyway, with food addiction, when I stopped eating. When I stopped eating and I had that boundary that I had committed with God to keep in place, it all of a sudden opened up my mind to so many other things, because food was no longer consuming me. So for somebody with food addiction, intermittent fasting is a phenomenal tool to recognize how food has just taken over so many things in your life, and how even when you're eating, when I was eating, I wasn't in a place of gratitude. I wasn't in a place of thinking of those who were hungry. I just wanted food, and I couldn't wait to get to more food. When I was fasting and I felt hunger, then I could really feel love on a level I'd never felt before, because I started to realize people in the world every day go hungry. Millions and millions of people feel hunger. I had never allowed myself to feel hunger without instantly fulfilling it. I had to learn that hunger was nothing to fear, but that it could teach me about my food addiction, about my negative body image, and about helping others who are hungry, because hunger is a really hard place to be. So intermittent fasting, I mean, there's so many tools that's why I had to write this book, because every day of my first 30 days, I was learning in leaps and bounds about these issues, and it was just so meaningful to be able to write them down.
You mentioned in your book, kind of transitioning into the writing experience itself, you have this great quote where you say, "Journaling is listening to yourself." As I read your book, and I felt like so when the book starts out, it's kind of the process of it's all about you and food, really. And as it goes on, it seems to get deeper and deeper and more meaningful in terms of it starts out kind of just about you and your problems, but then as the book develops, it's about you pulling God into the equation and you including other people in your fast. And that's when the book, to me, really starts to gain momentum. And I felt like when that happened, when those ingredients came together, including God, desiring to help others, of course, wanting what's good for yourself as well is a great thing. And then journaling. So the combination of those four things, I felt like you were tapped in to some type of enlightenment at that point. So could you talk a little bit about, did you actually feel like the book gained momentum as these pieces fell into place, and what was that enlightening process like?
Yeah, I think, the first day I fasted for a sister of mine who was struggling with, our sister, I should say, who was struggling with some health issues. And so, it really started building from there. I'd heard a leader of my church say, "Have you fasted for your children?" And I took that into pattern. I fasted one day for each of my children. And my children would know. I pulled, my older son aside, "I'm fasting for you today." The day I fasted for my daughter, she woke up and she said, "Mommy, is today the day you're fasting for me?" So they were all very excited when they knew it was their special day.
It was like they were getting a gift.
They knew that whole day I was thinking of them and their talents and their needs, and I was going before God and asking Him to bless them. So they did. They definitely felt that was a special day for them. And
so kids don't just need material gifts.
I've always been very spiritual, but I'd never been really practical with my religion. There's daily things I really should have been doing as a Christian, and I wasn't doing those daily things. When I started fasting, prayer, reading from the scriptures, that's how I ended each fast. I would start it with a prayer, and I would end it with a prayer and a scripture. And so everything came alive for me. I think that's why you feel the momentum grow so much in this book, because I was living, breathing a fasting experience that kept me almost hand in hand with God. I was, 16 to 18 hours a day doing something, holding His hand to get through that hunger, to get through whatever negative voices in my head that were telling me, that in the past had said to me, "Who do you think you are? You can't do this. You'll never be as good as them." Those voices from day one of my fast were hushed. When I was fasting, it's like my physical body would become weak, and the spirit in me, or what some people would call the soul, became strong. And let me tell you something, the soul or the spirit is connected with Heavenly Father, with God. And so when I was fasting, it's like that part of me became so much brighter. And my spirit loves me. My spirit has so many things to share with me about what I can accomplish, how good I'm doing, that I am special. So once I started to see that intermittent fasting and prayer were a tool for me to stop the negative voices, to stop living in procrastination, to start improving my health, to start sleeping better, then my daily fast, the momentum was just incredible. I was on a high. I was literally living each day. I couldn't wait to start that next day. Like, there's no way you could have tempted me to eat during my fast. I mean, you couldn't have forced me to eat, because it was such a joy to live in the state of that fast. that it just started to take over. I couldn't live in that negative world I'd been in before. And writing about it, documenting it, I think it made it that much more clear what I was experiencing.
I remember when you were 21 days into your fast, and I came over and saw you that night. And, we talk maybe every 7 to 10 days on the phone, or we see each other. But I noticed a physical change in you. I mean, your posture, your countenance, there was like a light in your eyes, and you were just sharing like wisdom. And so I think it was a family party, and there were many people there and many conversations going on. A lot of people I love and definitely wanted to catch up with, but I found myself being drawn to you and wanting to kind of go away into a little private place because, granted, I love talking, but the one thing I do love more than talking is learning. And so I wanted to just learn from you. Do you remember that night? And what was going on?
Well, I wrote about that night because it was so meaningful to me, but I hadn't shared with anybody besides Mom and Dad and Derek and my kids what I was doing. So, you didn't even know what I was doing at the time. Because I
knew something was going on.
Yeah, it was so like private and weird. Like, who is so excited to go, all this time every day without eating? So it had been a very, personal experience up to that point. But I wanted you to know I'd had a special fast for you and your family. So that's kind of how we started discussing it, is you were struggling with some health issues, and I mentioned to you, I fasted for you on this certain day. And then you had mentioned, that's so interesting because that day I got some encouragement from God that you had been seeking. And so we continued in this discussion about intermittent fasting. And you were kind of the first person that I really opened up to about it, besides Mom and Dad and Derek. And just the validation I got that night made me feel like perhaps what I was experiencing wasn't so weird. That maybe I knew it was something that was like at an elevated, like I'd never lived on such a high. I was seeing meaning in everything. Like one morning I woke up and I looked out my window and saw a rose bush. And I just had this idea, who had the thought to take a rose and turn it into a crown of thorns and put it on the head of Christ? I would look at sunsets and find meaning. It's like the world around me, rain and smells of nature and wind, all these things had meaning to me as I was going about my day. They were encouraging me. They were happy for me. They knew what I was going through. So I think at that point, with that conversation from you, learning that you had experienced a gift from God the day I fasted for you. Wow, that was very special.
I remember the day you fasted for me. And what had happened was, so I have some inflammation problems in my elbow and my feet that caused me not to be able to exercise to the degree I'd like to. And so, I've spent a lot of money, seen a lot of doctors trying to figure out. It's kind of one of the mystery things where you wish you had like a Doogie Howser or a House MD to just, figure out what's wrong with you. So I felt like 2016 was going to be the year where I was going to find something that was going to help me. And I had, the best way to describe it is just as hope. And that's what I felt and shared with you. And that hope has continued to this day. And I have found some things that have helped me and are continuing to help me. So I feel like I'm on a path now to health that allows me to live with hope and not frustration. So thank you for that gift. When you mentioned that things in nature had meaning, the rose bush, the wind, rain, throughout the scriptures we see God using nature to testify of himself. There's an earthquake when God's angry. There's rain when God wants to represent cleanliness. The wind is his spirit or his voice talking to us. What is it that allowed you to see meaning in things during this process?
Well, fasting definitely hushed my mind. It took away all those negative voices, all the doubts, all the what ifs. It just hushed that all. I was so present. It was something in the hunger. The hunger along with the intentional prayer. Hunger doesn't let you live out of the moment for long before it just pulls you right back in. And I think it was on the third or fourth day, I had an experience where I was actually thinking about my son. So I was 42 when I had my sixth child, and he was a surprise. And I'd really struggled with the pregnancy. I did not want to be pregnant, and I didn't know how I was going to do it. I was already overwhelmed with my 5 other children. But after I had my son, there's that instant bond. But one thing that continued to haunt me is that, that children like him are aborted. I was like the classic case for an abortion. I already had 4 sons.
The classic case to have an abortion.
Yeah, I really was, because, I was older. I had health issues. He was unplanned. I already had 4 boys, a 5th boy,
and a daughter.
And I'd had, my daughter was my 5th child, so technically it's like, great, you got your girl, you're done. And I had all these ambitions. I wanted to write, and I wanted to build my furniture business, and I felt horrible guilt for not wanting to be pregnant that entire pregnancy. But because of my faith, I carried on. After my son was born, and I reflected on how this is why women abort children, right? Timing isn't right, inconvenience, they want a different gender, their health is an issue. I had every single one. And I became almost obsessed with the study of abortion. And it was on this 4th day of my fast that I was really considering the miracle of my son and how much joy he brought me. That I went outside, and it had just rained, and I went and I picked a piece of fruit off my tree. And the water from the tree fell on my face. It was very cold, and it startled me, and I was shocked, and it wasn't a good sensation. And I was kind of frustrated. And something in my mind said, listen to her, she's crying with you. And I had been crying that morning about babies that get aborted. Because of my love for my son, abortion had just become so real to me that daily I was aware of children who were getting aborted. So that was kind of my first experience while fasting, where I recognized, this tree knows my emotions. And throughout that fast, throughout that first 30 days, I continued to be influenced by nature, to be validated, to be encouraged that my feelings were being noticed by the environment around me.
Mm-hmm. And that God's intelligence and influence is in nature.
It's all around us.
Testifying, teaching.
It's in every air, every breath we take.
And it's encouraging that nature was uplifting you. It wasn't condemning you.
Right.
It was love. It was a manifestation of God's love. And
it's interesting because, who would really think that, right? That a tree is crying with you. But in that fast, my confidence grew to such a level that I could not doubt myself even if I tried. Because things were happening that were so unusual. They were all so good, but they were very unusual. And as I would reflect on them and write about them, I would try to say, is this really what happened? It was almost like I was doing an interview of myself. And the confidence in things I was experiencing just continued to push me forward and continued to happen more and more often.
And that's the confidence I saw in you that night, on your 21st day of fasting. Let's talk about abortion for a minute. I didn't realize when I started reading the book that was going to be a key part of what you stand for. That you're pro-life and very passionate about that. And you frame the debate in an unusual way, a very healthy way, I believe. The typical abortion debate, you think of like, the extreme right wing, like pro-life people on one side of the street with their signs, and then you got the extreme pro-choice people on the other side, and they're like yelling at each other, and there's police in the middle, making sure they don't attack each other. But you kind of take a different approach because, like you mentioned, you were an ideal candidate for an abortion because you were 42 and you already had a big family and health problems. You seem to have developed kind of a sympathy for those who do have abortions, kind of a compassion for what they have to go through. And it was a very non-judgmental approach to having a dialogue, really, with someone who is pro-choice. Could you talk about what you were feeling, and how would you help us, have those discussions with people that maybe have a different position on abortion than us, without attacking each other?
Yeah, and I'll be honest with you, a book on intermittent fasting, it's interesting to bring in a discussion about abortion. But Tad, every time I would work on this book, abortion had impacted me for many years. So there was no way I could leave this discussion out of the book. And when I was younger, like I said, as a teenager, I was sexually abused. That experience opened up a lot of dysfunction in my life. And I almost seemed to attract men who knew they could take advantage of me. I was very vulnerable, and I had a lot of shame from what I had been through. I was a very religious young person, and so I felt like I had sinned and done many things wrong. And I no longer saw myself as somebody of worth. And so when I was 25, I had an experience where I was taken advantage of, and I wasn't sure if I had become pregnant or not. And for several weeks, I spent a lot of time in bed crying, and was in a lot of uncertainty in my life. And if I was pregnant, what would I do? And I considered abortion at that time. It wasn't for very long. I considered it for about 3 minutes. And just the fact that I considered it influenced me for the rest of my life. Several weeks later, I found out I was not pregnant. And, but I still felt haunted by that. I didn't realize how much until I started my 30-day fast. It's interesting, fasting just brought everything I've gone through in my life right up to the surface. And so I look at abortion with this thesis. If 1 out of 3 girls in America is sexually abused, then how many of those girls feel like me, go through life not feeling that they have much worth? They're vulnerable. They attract dysfunctional men. And like me, many years later become pregnant because they're in such dysfunctional relationships. My thesis is that sexual abuse can eventually lead to abortion, because those boundaries have been broken for those girls. They were broken for me. So what happened when I had my son at the age of 42? He was unplanned. And in many aspects, I was able to redeem that experience. I was able to have that baby. And I end up starting a campaign, when my son was about 12 months old. And I'd been fasting for maybe 4 or 5 months. I would carry my little son around, and I would tell him all the time, "Baby, you're worth it." Because even after having him, there were days I was like, oh my gosh, this is like such a challenge, But I would always tell him, you're worth it, you're worth it. And so instead of looking at abortion as a pro-life, pro-choice issue, I was looking at my son. And I was like, this baby is worth it, no matter how hard it was to bring him here. So I started babyyourworthit.com, and I started using him in some social media campaigns. And that's really where I think that's why you said my approach is so different. It's not political, and it's not putting one side against the other. It's just holding up my baby, who is now 20 months old, and just saying he was worth it. That's really my stance with this issue.
Our mom is an author, and her purpose for writing books is, well, she is pretty much one of the world's leading researchers on pre-birth experiences. She collects stories about people who have had experiences with their unborn children that cause them to keep the pregnancy, or have faith that they can have this baby and this is God's will and things will work out for the best. Kind of similar to your position on encouraging people, baby, you're worth it. So, and then of course our dad, as you mentioned, he's a psychologist, a PhD. He's always been very interested in helping people find their self-worth, set goals, reach your potential. And so all that kind of comes together, makes for some interesting parents for you to now be a writer. How is your parents' role, what they do, what they believe, helped you in writing this book?
From the start, because I had several years earlier helped Mom write her memoir. Her publisher had said, look, how did you become this collector of these stories of these unborn children? And, one thing that Mom did, her name's Sarah Hinze, is she asked the question, where do our children come from before they're born? And when she started her research, she collected stories from usually mothers, sometimes fathers or other relatives who'd seen this unborn child in either a dream or a vision or some other experience. So they knew this child was living, even though this child had yet to be born, sometimes even conceived. So when Mom's publisher asked her to write her memoir, I was able to sit down with Mom, and although I'd always understood, her writing and her books, I really got to dive into the world of how you start to write and research. And one thing that she taught me during that time was, she said, it's okay as a researcher to ask a question, even if you don't know the answer. And even to write about it, just in the collecting of the research, even if you don't come to a clear conclusion, just the collecting of the research is valid enough to start sharing, this path. And so when I started my book, Starving Girl, and I started intermittent fasting, I had a lot of questions about why we throw things away. I had questions about abortion, about the food industry, why we are constantly in media, the commercials about food, the fourth meal of the day, eat, consume. I mean, it's just everywhere. I started to ask questions about that. When I was studying intermittent fasting, I read an article about, breakfast is not the most important meal of the day. We've been taught that since we were young kids. So I think because I had a mother and a father who were both researchers, they taught me growing up, push the envelope, ask questions about things that are considered normal in society and see what's behind that. I started to ask questions about, propaganda, about body image, about the modeling industry, and about these images that we as women are thrown. We're supposed to look a certain way and act a certain way and dress a certain way. And if we're not a certain size, we're not socially acceptable. We're not beautiful. We don't have this standard of beauty. I started to ask questions about that. And I got to a point near the end of my fast where one day I just felt I needed to ask God, what type of body did he want me to have? I'd always accepted the world's image of what I was supposed to look like. And I went in prayer and said, what type of body do you want me to have? I started to recognize, I'd birthed 6 children. I'd been strong and healthy, and I had worked, and I had done things with my body that I had never appreciated. So I think that's where having, particularly Mom, her influence as a writer, of asking hard questions, really put me in a place where I could do that as well.
You mentioned that Mom and Dad taught you to question social norms and do your research, come to your own conclusions. During the book, you discuss some hard topics, things that people typically keep buried deep down inside. They're not comfortable putting them out there for the world to see, like sexual abuse, abortion. So it comes across like this is empowering for you. The typical narrative is that you'll be ashamed and that people will think less of you, but this seemed kind of empowering for you to do this. Can you talk a little bit about what gave you the courage to be able to discuss this, and how do you feel that this will help other women to find the courage to open up and look for healing for themselves and try to help others?
Well, it's funny because when I first started writing my query letter, when I was trying to get the book published, I first wrote this sentence, something about, I was this 43-year-old mother, overweight, overwhelmed, and I go through fasting, and eventually I kind of find this way to overcome tragedy in my life, And I love reading, and I've read a lot of stories about women who've overcome incredible odds. And I've never experienced and faced challenges that other women have that are so monumental. These were kind of smaller challenges, I guess you could say. And fasting is the first time I felt like I could share my story, not my story of sorrow, not my story of tragedy, not my story of abuse, my story of overcoming. And that's why I could write it, because it finally had an ending where I knew I had overcome.
No, yeah, and that's certainly understandable that you felt like when you overcame some of these challenges, then you had the courage to write about them, because that wasn't who you were anymore. Right. So what about those women who they're still in that position where they haven't overcome it yet? What advice would you give to them? How can they be empowered when they haven't overcome it yet, but they want to be?
That saying, the truth shall set you free. I think I'd been lying to myself for so many years. And I had been ignoring my relationship with God. I had been living in with a lot of shame and guilt and addiction. And I had to do my work. I am so far from where I want to be still. I mean, every day I still struggle. But I can see clearly. I can see dysfunction when I come face to face with it. And all these experiences, they take time, they take love, they take learning to love yourself. They take learning about dysfunction and knowing that other people who took advantage of you, it wasn't your fault. And to stop carrying the burden of other people's sin and cruelty and dysfunction, to let those people go. And I write pretty openly about the man who sexually abused me when I was 18, and he ended up committing suicide. and I was about 24 or 25 when that happened. And I went to his funeral, and I got to see him. I hadn't seen him since I was 18. And, you know, he kept coming up. I like to write novels. I write young adult fiction as well. And he kept coming up in almost every book I was writing. This character of this man, this dysfunctional, creepy man, kept coming up. And when I was fasting, I was able to revisit him at the funeral and revisit walking up to him at the casket and revisit the man who I'd written about in this young adult novel and finally forgive him. So for me, forgiveness was a big step as well. And it's about reaching out. So many girls go through this. I wasn't alone. I felt alone for so long. And once I started Project Used, which was an awareness campaign where I loved wearing used dresses. And one day I realized, you know, I'm used. I've been discarded and thrown away. So just finding meaning, finding ways to build yourself back up, finding worth in yourself. And sometimes that starts with finding worth in others, finding value in things around you, and then applying it to yourself.
I remember in your book when you went to the funeral of the man who had abused you, and I kind of had this ominous feeling like, no, don't go. There's no way this could turn out well. And then you ended up forgiving him, and it's one of those things where he didn't abuse me, but it was even hard for me to accept that you had forgiven him. So I think another thing I hear you saying is that, you know, it is empowering to forgive at the right time and the right place, of course. So that's a powerful lesson takeaway from your book. Let's talk about the title and the cover of your book. So first, you know, the cover is really interesting. It's you with your long blonde hair hanging down, and I can just see from the top of your lips down, I can see your chin, I can see your bright red shirt, and in your hands you're holding a pine cone, almost like it's something sacred or like an offering. Now in the book, you do mention what this means. Could you tell us in your own words why this cover and why this title as well?
Well, when I was little, I loved pine cones, and I would pick them up off the ground, and I now live in a home that has these giant pine trees. And when I was fasting, because everything was coming alive for me, even being in my front yard, hearing the wind go through those trees, it's like those trees were my friends. They supported me. And I remember as a little girl picking up pine cones, and I just marveled what they could become. So in my book, pine cones started to symbolize courage, because when I first started, my courage was so small. It was just a seed. But intermittent fasting helped me plant that. And my courage grew so big and so giant. So that's where the pine cone comes from. As far as the title Starving Girl, I really went back and forth between like Christ-centered eating, because so much of how I was eating was to honor Jesus Christ and God. But I learned so much about people who are starving. It was on my second day of fasting that I was so hungry. I very exaggerated, I said this cry out to God, and I said, why can't I eat? I'm starving. And I had this experience where I felt like I was being taught, you know, you're in a house full of food. You are not starving. You are hungry. But people in the world are starving on a level that you will never understand. They don't get to eat at the end of the day. And so Starving Girl became a cry for me to help those girls who are really starving. First of all, I was starving. It wasn't food. I was starving to live my purpose. And once I started fasting and recognizing all the girls that go hungry, all the people that go hungry. I made a commitment to give the money I had saved from going all those days without meals to the poor and to the hungry. So at the end of the book, I make an offering to those who are hungry. And because I talk about sexual abuse and because I talk about abortion, I do introduce sex-selected abortion. I do introduce the abuse that girls go through in different societies. So the title is meaningful on kind of a spectrum. And I was asked by I asked a colleague of mine if she would read my book before I published it. And she came to me and she said, "Is Starving Girl the title you want? Couldn't you call it Hungry Girl?" And I really contemplated that, and it's like, no, I wasn't hungry to live my purpose. I was starving. And these girls who really struggle with hunger, whether it be through anorexia, body dysmorphia, negative body image issues, obesity, there's such a spectrum of girls who struggle on any range of the spectrum. I think that we're all starving for something.
I think there's a lot of people that aren't familiar with the term intermittent fasting. Who is it for, and how would you advise people to get started?
Well, I'm not a doctor, and I have never, studied in great depth enough for me to advise people. So if you do want to start intermittent fasting, I definitely encourage you to go to your own doctor, to do your own research. When I started, I was doing this for religious purposes. So I was going in prayer to God several times throughout the day. And I also felt like I was being directed by different impressions or experiences around me. So when I started, I didn't go cold turkey. I would drink grapefruit juice. I would go pick some grapefruits from my tree. I would drink chicken broth. And I would also have a scoop of protein powder and water. I kind of make like a hot chocolate with it. And it wasn't until probably the third week that I could start letting go of maybe one of those things. And it was towards the end of my fast that I was finally able to give up even the grapefruit juice. So I could go the full 16 hours. So I definitely recommend going into it gradually. If you have, feelings that you're going to faint or, please do your research, go to your doctor and gradually go into it. I would also make it intentional.
Yeah, that was encouraging, because I know me, when I fast, once a month, I know after like 16 hours often I start to get a headache.
Yeah.
And if I don't, eat an orange or something to keep me going, then the day becomes kind of wasted. What started out trying to be like a spiritual day turns into a migraine. Mm-hmm. And then you're no good for the rest of the day. You're not helpful. You're in bed with a cloth over your eyes. So I did appreciate the ability. I mean, even Gandhi, had some lemon juice or whatever when he fasted. But the idea that, if your body is telling you you need something, then...
Yeah, definitely listen to your body.
Listen to your body, but you will get stronger as you do it more often.
Yeah, you'll adapt. I drank a lot of herbal tea, a lot of water, ice. I love ice and water. I'm not an ice chewer, but I did chew gum. So I would have gum on hand. And, don't be too hard on yourself. I mean, when I first started drinking the protein powder, I knew I just had to do it. I wanted to do a full no food fast, but I did have to have what I call my food crutches to get me through adapting to it. And I would definitely say to be intentional in your fast. Make a intentional commitment to have your sacrifice go to bless somebody else. And even if you're not a religious person, I would either through journaling, through maybe writing it down on something that you could see throughout the day, to know that that hunger is to honor somebody else and to bless them. So those two things are what I would advise somebody who was going to start out.
And you also would advise that a lot of the money that you save by fasting, you kind of, to a certain degree, you kept track of that, or you felt like at the end of the story, you needed to give an offering to someone, to the poor.
I'd read a quote
to kind of complete this process.
Right. And this quote I read by one of our church leaders said that after a fast, if an offering to the poor is not made, then God will not honor the fast. And I hadn't considered that the first, 25 days of my fast, to actually give something to the poor. And so the first time I felt impressed to give money to the poor, it was a significant amount of money. It was $1,000. And we hadn't even paid off my son's birth bill from the hospital. So that just seemed like so much money to me. I didn't know how I was going to do that. But I'd learned to recognize what I felt was the voice of God. So when I had the impression to pay $1,000, I knew I would have to find a way to do it. And my husband's so supportive. He immediately said, yeah, let's do it. So it took me some time. I didn't pay the fast offering at the end of my 30 days. It took me a couple more weeks before I could budget the money and find the courage to give that money to the poor. But we were able to give it to some girls in India, and we have their little pictures on our fridge. And let me tell you, the way that money has blessed us, we gave that money out, and we have had so many financial blessings since we paid that money to the poor, that it's come back to us like 10 times over. So I believe in the law of the fast offering. In our society, the diet industry is like a multi-billion-dollar industry. And they do all this propaganda to convince us to buy their products. And what I love so much about intermittent fasting is it's free. So you then in turn can give that money to really help those in need.
You have a lot of platforms out there as you are getting your message out through your books, your blogs. I read this quote on, I think it was your Facebook post. This is a quote from you, and it says, "In a world of never enoughs and constant shortages, there is one thing we have an unlimited supply of: our stories." What are you trying to accomplish with that quote? Who are you reaching out to?
I've spent so much of my life reading. I mentioned I struggled as a young girl. Once I was able to understand, usually about the age of 23, I started to really like to read. And I read fiction my entire life until I wrote Mom's memoir, The Memory Catcher. Once I wrote that memoir, I became so hungry for memoirs. And as a writer, I'm like, why am I always trying to write about things made up? When these stories are all around us, they're so much more powerful if we have the courage to share them. So I want other people to know that there's power in their story. And we have hundreds of stories. When I read a good memoir, that memoir may have taken that woman 10 years to write. Maybe it's, about her life that she's lived 40 or 50 years. And I can read it in 2 or 3 days. And what do I want next? I want the next story. There is a constant need of stories of how we've overcome, of how we have done good things, how we've celebrated our lives, how we've overcome. Did I say that twice? Anyway, so I've started a publishing house. It's called Vintage Bird Press, and I'm hoping to publish inspiring memoirs. And I just encourage people to find their own story. Their life is beautiful. They've lived something unique that others need to hear. Even if it's just family members, even if it's just a child who's hurting or struggling, be brave in how you share your stories. Don't hide behind them. Don't think that you're weak because of things you've gone through. Flip that story over and see the bright side, and see the things that you have done that actually symbolize great strength and great courage. That's what this experience did for me. This 30-day fast, which eventually turned into a year of fasting, has helped me see that I wasn't weak, I wasn't worthless, I wasn't a piece of trash. I was just a girl who was trying to learn from what I'd been through, and had spent too much of my life feeling doubt and shame. And even with all the love in my life, I have a fabulous family, I have a beautiful faith that I follow, I married an incredible man, have strong, healthy, bright, beautiful children. Even with everything good in my life, I still struggled, and I still struggle. But it's in that commitment and in that intention to live in a way that you try to see the best, you try to forgive, and you make that intention to love. And that's what I've learned through this. And I hope those that read Starving Girl will know that this wasn't easy for me to write, but I felt called to do it. And it's my pleasure to share these experiences and hope that other people can overcome what they're going through as well.
Well, as we begin to wrap this podcast up, I just wanted to thank you for writing the book, Starving Girl, and for taking the time to discuss it. I feel like it was beneficial for me to learn more about who you are and the good intentions with which you wrote this book, the courage it took, and how you're an advocate for women to tell their stories. I certainly know that I would encourage my wife, my daughters, my female friends to read the book as well. The book influenced me in a couple ways. One of them was just this concept of fasting, to have faith in God's ancient promises, that they can still be real and alive today, just as they were for ancient prophets in the scriptures. Also, this idea that no experience, no matter how bad, is worthless, and we can find meaning and strength in power through, asking God for help, maybe even through journaling or just pondering and thinking about the struggles we've had, and God helping us turn those weaknesses into a strength. That's clearly what I see this process as you've turned, things that 5 years ago you would have thought this was your weakness, but here you are today and it's now your strength. I've seen that happen in your life. So those were, two huge takeaways, two positive things that I can apply to my life for your book. It's not a super long book. It's, right around 200 pages. About 95% of it is the memoir, and then at the end you have a question and answer section, which was really helpful. It was interesting to see you transition from kind of the memoir style to the Q&A, kind of a nonfiction type style, and I thought you were able to write effectively in both styles. As we conclude, Laura, I just wanted to ask you if you had any final thoughts.
Yes, I continue to write on My Dear Trash, so you can usually do weekly updates on that blog. I'll write more often when I have time, but remember, I still have a 1-year-old. I am finishing up my 3rd book called What Has Your Sister Done? And it's a collection of stories of unplanned pregnancy. And that will be available. You can find it on my website, or it'll be on Amazon and Kindle by the end of spring, early summer, something like that. I'm also working on a book on how to write your own memoir. That'll probably be coming out at the end of the year. I'm very active on social media, so if you follow Mind Your Trash on Facebook, and you can also follow Laura Lofgreen on Facebook and Instagram to see what I'm up to. And I continue to advocate for my little girls in India that because I continue to fast, and so that money continues to go to them. And since I've written the book, I've started teaching creative writing at a charter school. I've lost 30 pounds and will continue fasting and cleaning up my eating. I still have to clean up my eating during my eating window.
And you've cleaned up your house.
And I've decluttered my home, which was a big part of this. And I've had the opportunity to speak out for babies through my Baby You're Worth It campaign. And I've also had the opportunity to publish this book. So many dreams have come to pass through this experience. I'm just so thankful that I've had the opportunity to practice intermittent fasting.
Well, thank you so much, Laura Lofgreen, for coming on the podcast discussing Starving Girl. And I know we've mentioned several other books and websites during this podcast, so we will post links below for your reference so you can quickly find anything that was of interest to you. So thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Tad. You're the best
brother. It was a pleasure. And we're all empowered and strengthened from what you've taught us. And good luck with your future projects.
Thank you. I love you so much.
Love you too.